Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the second most powerful politics podcast in the world. I'm Andreou, the second most handsome host in the world. On today's show, the Tories continue with a shoot first, delete later insane approach to election campaigning, with polls refusing to budge. Is there method or just madness? And far from being done, Brexit is about to make life even more expensive. What are the latest import charges and how will they affect businesses and consumers? Plus, we select our latest heroes and villains. Let's meet the panel. First up, returning from sunny Tenerife, it's freshly tanned political comedian Matt Green. And when I say freshly tanned, I mean that he's now merely off-white. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
Matt, last week we saw foreign ministers meet in Brussels for a NATO summit. The conversation was dominated by Israel, Hamas, and Ukraine, Russia, of course. Is there a sense of renewed unity, or are the cracks beginning to appear?
So this was them coming together for the 75th anniversary of NATO, which I was slightly struck by that because it felt like that's not generally an age that you celebrate, but it feels like it's getting to a point where they're celebrating every milestone they can because there's possible, chances that it might be their last. I think NATO is still representing being very strong in Ukraine. Antony Blinken from the US pledged rock solid support, but that is quite undermined by the fact that Congress is still holding up all of the aid.
Yeah.
And it does feel to me that every time I've seen anything about this, that the countries, when they get together, they're very keen to say how much they support Ukraine and how much they are all together and united. But their domestic audiences are hearing something quite different, that in France, Macron was talking very tough, but then he's reducing exports from Ukraine because of demands of farmers. That's happening all around Europe. Exports from Ukraine, imports to France. And the danger is that the European elections are going to lead to a lot more kind of far-right, pro-Putin representation. So I think, they're saying the right thing in public, but it feels like maybe domestic audiences are hearing something else. And on Israel, Hamas, the killing of the aid workers clearly sparked a huge amount of anger. The US and the UK have given their strongest condemnations yet. Feels like lots of countries, that's become a kind of tipping point. And although generally Israel is still...
Wait a minute, now you're killing white people.
Well, yeah, sadly, that does feel like that's what's happening. And it feels like countries are making stronger and stronger statements. It feels like it's getting to a point now where, that's getting more and more difficult for them to hold the line.
And many commented on a video released by Cameron and how slick his communication skills appeared compared to what we've had in the last few years. Is his plan to rehabilitate himself working?
I mean, it's quite an impressive video. When I watched it, it's like 2.5 minutes of him talking to camera, walking from presumably just outside the council building to just outside his car. And he does it pretty well. I only noticed one fluff. It did make me wonder how many times they'd done it, whether that was like take 6. And they were like, all right, fine, we've got it. Fine, he said one thing wrong, but we'll carry on. As these things go, he is a very impressive communicator when compared to the people around him. I think when you compare him to Rishi Sunak, he's far and away better than Sunak, but then a chair would be a more effective communicator. Yeah. But then he was replacing Liz Truss, who was even worse. So it feels like, Cameron's much more impressive than they are. But he said something at NATO conference, which I thought was interesting. He said, we need to win the argument for NATO for a new generation, which sounds, I understand what he's saying there, but it does feel a bit to me like he's saying, we need to get on TikTok. That's where the young people are. We've got to open a TikTok account, buy some new jeans, and also Cameron did try and make the argument for the EU, and that didn't really go very well.
Also back from a well-deserved holiday, journalist and Oh God What Now regular Hannah Fearn. Hi, Hannah.
Hello. I'm even pastier because I went to Dorset and it rained every day. So
well, exactly. So
came back right when I left.
A group of former British diplomats have published an essay, a sort of pamphlet on the future of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that is causing quite a bit of a stir in Whitehall. What do they propose?
Well, they propose some interesting things. But first of all, the criticisms that underpin it are almost like a list of, if you went out into the street and said, what do you think about the Foreign Office? You'd probably get most of these back anyway. Right. It's outdated, it's elitist, it's rooted in the past, operates like a giant private office for the Foreign Secretary who changes every 10 minutes anyway. And there's not enough, long-term diplomacy and really thinking about our place in the world. And the thing that really struck out of me is their criticisms of the office. This is this beautiful office.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's one of the most remarkable buildings on Whitehall, but it's completely impossible to do modern business in. It's all
Yeah.
tiny mahogany rooms. It's like it's set for some kind of, period drama rather than actually the business of running a country. So, they propose scrapping it essentially and putting together a new kind of department which solves a lot of the problems that were created by the failed merger, really, of DFID and FCO in the first place. They have come together, but it's been very disharmonious process. They are looking at, they propose 1% of gross national income to be devoted to international engagement in this new department, including aid, and 2% of GDP, which is on defence spending. And you create this kind of new department that's overseeing.
Soft and hard power, effectively.
What I discovered this week that I didn't know before, really interesting, is that one of the problems that the FCO has is that it's a massive brain drain to other Whitehall departments and to other sectors entirely.
Yeah.
And the reason is they're really poorly paid compared to other departments. I didn't know this. Particularly those who are entering in early jobs, they're paid basically wages that make it very difficult to sustain a life in London. And in the past, the idea was that you'd make it up on your postings. You go overseas, your housing's covered, your children's education is covered, all of those things. And so over the course of your career, you'd be doing fine. But none of those things quite stack up anymore. Partly there aren't as many overseas postings, so these jobs are not as plentiful as they were. But also, the whole idea that one FCO income can sustain a family these days, travelling overseas with the partner, whether that's a woman or a man, it doesn't stack up. You need two incomes for UK housing costs now, and so they're just losing staff because nobody can make it work anymore. And apparently, with the merger, DFID and FCO staff have not harmonised pay scales yet, and that's causing a lot of internal
because DFID are better paid. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. This is really interesting, and it does sound, from what I've been hearing, like there would be a lot of support for some kind of big radical shake-up.
And we have spoken before about the need to break up the chaotic Home Office. So I was wondering, does this sort of reorganisation, department level, present a future Labour government with an opportunity to really make a big impact at relatively low cost?
Yeah, and I think the reason that these kind of big think pieces and reports are coming out now is that people really realise that opportunity. So they're all lobbying for what they think is the right thing to do. Sue Gray is probably redrawing the whole of Whitehall.
The best person to
Absolutely,
do this,
she
right?
understands it back to front. And it's a really great way to get rid of baggage as well. If you think about the Home Office, everything that we think about the Home Office, where it's become synonymous with this kind of evil, Orwellian kind of character. Now you can get rid of that, call it something else entirely, and remove the
nice
baggage.
Office.
Yeah, exactly. Kind and gentle and welcoming.
Yeah.
But and also the best time to do it is right at the beginning of a new administration, because restructures like that always take up and waste loads of civil service time. So but it takes ages to settle in the new administration anyway. So yeah, I expect rip it up and start over is going to be Starmer's plan.
And would it be an opportunity to, if the Foreign Office offices are so lovely, open them up as like a tourist attraction?
Genuinely, that is probably what they're best used for now.
I mean, I remember the first time I went there and saw an actual civil servant, and this was in the 2000s, walk into a room, turn around and bow to the photo of the Queen that hangs above every single door in that building. So that's my...
Have they replaced them all with Charles now? We need to find out.
I imagine.
Presumably.
So. Yeah, I mean, it'd be pretty crap. First up, you may have seen a rather peculiar election campaign poster shared by the Conservative Party last week. If you haven't, it might be because they deleted it, so let me fill you in. It was a Pritt stick collage of images torn out of magazines in a retro style, echoing maybe a blackmailer on Murder, She Wrote. The images included King Charles, a fighter jet, a car, the England men's football team, Christopher Nolan, the Red Arrows, and a container ship. And right at the centre of that strange English sausage fest, an image of Rishi Sunak, larger than anything else, under the headline, "Britain is the second most powerful country in the world." You would think that if the William Ragg episode has taught the Conservatives anything, it is that once you post a dick pic, there are no takesy-backsies. And yet, on a weekly basis, the Tories continue to expose themselves. As desperate and clueless, that is. Is there some 4D chess being played here that we are failing to see? Or is this just tiddlywinks to pass the time before they are ejected from office? Matt, what was your reaction to this glorious image?
Well, I'll be honest, I was quite happy I was on holiday because I sort of just idly swiping Twitter one morning and thought, how do you satirize that? It's like a self-satirizing piece of work. It's obviously stupid. The second most powerful country in the world that capitalized. It was insane. I mean, people immediately were doing sort of Alan Partridge versions of it, which
and the Royal College of Dentists did quite a good one with a man pulling out his own teeth right at the front.
It's very funny, and the thing is, it was a classic example of like every aspect of it either made no sense or was dodgy in some way. Using the king in political advertising is pretty dodgy. That's not something people tend to say is a good thing. Aston Martin, Canadian-owned. Christopher Nolan, he's dual citizenship. He's a representative of the film industry. They've been cutting funding to arts left, right and centre. The Typhoon is built by Europeans, of course, consortium, including us, but mostly Europeans. The F-35 is an American plane. You can just go on and on. There were no women, as you've already mentioned. Yeah. Also, it was the England men's football team who've never won anything
for ages.
Only represent one of the nations.
And only represent one of the countries. So every aspect of it, every time you go, well, you should have been the women's football team. But also, they still wouldn't represent the UK. And they seem to be confused between the UK and Great Britain and all these different things.
The accompanying text said, "Don't let the doomsters and naysayers trick you into talking down our country. The UK is as strong as ever." But days before the Conservative Party launched bizarre attacks on London and Birmingham, depicting those two cities as Gotham-like dystopian hellholes, could there be a strategy behind their campaign that we don't see because we're not the intended audience, or is it just chaos?
I don't know. I mean, it feels like, to me, the definition of a base strategy of going after the people who already agree with you and just sort of G them up a bit. People who, read the Express, the Mail, spend all day posting about how awful their neighbours are on Nextdoor. It's simultaneously nostalgic and pessimistic. And it's basically MAGA, isn't it? It's basically the version is make Great Britain great again, but that doesn't really work because it'd be or something. And it feels like that. And I actually looked up because I found the word doomster. I thought, has anyone ever used that word before Boris Johnson? I actually looked it up in the OED today because that's how cool I am. And doomster. It's not a word it's not a modern word. Apparently it comes from the 15th century. It's a Scottish legal term meaning a judge or official, sometimes an executioner, who formally repeated the death sentence. So it's doomster. He's a doomster. He's someone who's killed people. So, but it's just these bizarre words that they use that nobody uses in real life. No one ever says you're a doomster. It's just not a thing. And yet, as you say, that's who it's appealing to, people who already think that.
I don't know if either of you are 30 Rock fans.
Yes.
It reminds me of a character Queen Latifah plays in it. It's a senator that always starts a speech and then she loses her thread. But she says the flags and the troops, and if I keep speaking in this tone, hopefully people are not going to notice. It feels like that level, right? If we accept the premise that there is an audience out there that responds to this sort of nativist hyperbole, won't the derision prove the thesis that naysayers like us love to talk down the country? Isn't that the trap?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this just feels very, very social media. It feels very designed for social media, particularly Twitter, X, whatever. We get to laugh at it. People who sort of agree with it get annoyed at us laughing at it, which makes us laugh at it more, which makes them more annoyed. It's this kind of spiral that just keeps going on. And we all get a bit stupider every day. I think that's all it is, really.
Hannah, what was the actual basis for that bizarre claim that the UK is the second most powerful country in the world?
So it was a report by an organisation called Brand Finance, and it was their Global Soft Power Index 2024, which polls people in 100 nations on their perception.
Soft, doing quite a lot of work.
A lot of work, yeah. They it's 100 nations and it's general, the general public polled on their perceptions of various states. And the idea is that it does assess their soft power, but there's some really interesting things about it. We come second to the US, and in third place is China. But also, the results seem to be very easily moved by global PR stunts like sports washing and so on, because the biggest risers in 2024 have been the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, none of which I would think of as particularly the best countries in the world. And it also, claims that, this is assessing those with a strong and stable economy and products and brands the world loves and so on. And on both measures, we apparently received a bump this year post a crash in 22 because of Liz Truss. But I think it suggests that the world hasn't quite caught up with reality here for us, because if we're number
they're still watching
2,
Brexiters.
they're lagging behind by about 12 months, and I wonder what it would be next year.
Well, I found it when I read the report. It was the way that they talked about nation brands made me.
I mean, it's icky, isn't it?
It's really icky.
Yeah.
It's like,
it's the Beatles. It's that kind of thing, isn't it?
Also,
everyone listens to pop music that's mostly American or British.
And TV and films
yes,
and all
so
that.
we're around. But also, there is one category, which is politically stable and well-governed. On that, we're nowhere near the top.
Oh, that's interesting. The Express reported this as a huge Brexit victory.
Yeah.
Don't laugh. Let's interrogate this. In what way is this Brexit-related at all?
It's not.
Okay, let's move on. Soft power is all about things like art, culture, diplomacy, touring bands, the BBC, the World Service, exchange programs like Erasmus. In short, exactly the sort of thing which they ideologically oppose as woke, right? Yeah. And practically defund every time money is tight. So is Britain's soft power actually something to be cherished and nourished, or is it a luxury? I mean, I know what you think. I just wonder what goes through their head.
I think that they think that soft power is things like Downton Abbey and James Bond, which don't require national funding. They happen through our creative industries and so on and get out there into the world. Actually, soft power isn't very soft at all. It's actually a very hard and important thing. And what's touchy-feely about national security? Nothing. But soft power has a huge impact on that. And as you said, you mentioned the World Service. That's exactly like a classic example. 400 jobs cut, moved to digital only. I looked this up because it was nagging at me. Half the world's population doesn't have access to a mobile phone, let alone 4G or 5G. So a digital-only World Service is completely devoid of its point in a way to reach out to everybody that it can stretch as far as it can. It's a really batshit decision that makes us all less safe, and inexplicable to me.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say my first contacts with this country as a foreigner, aside from music and film, were the British Council and BBC World Service. Those are the things that...
I mean, wherever you go in the world, you can go to some really remote places, and the World Service people know the BBC.
Yeah. Matt, they ended up having to delete the tweet, just like they had to delete that film about London depicting Penn Station in New York as an illustration of the London Underground. Isn't having the front to ride out the criticism, or even double down, as Trump does, for instance, essential to this sort of campaign? Can one be a weak strongman?
That sounds like a brilliant description of Rishi Sunak at the moment. It feels like that's exactly what he is. He's someone who'd say, my motto is never apologize, never explain. Sorry, I should explain what a motto is. It's a mission statement. It's that kind of, he's trying to do one thing, but his heart's not in it, really. Yeah. And every time he does one of these things, he immediately kind of backs away from it or sort of hedges it or something. But the thing is, when you said they had to delete it, I did find that interesting. Because did they have to delete it? Because I wonder if they did. I wonder if it was like a copyright thing that one of the images they weren't allowed to use or something.
It would have been loads of stuff like that, right?
And it feels weird that they didn't delete the London one. They made a minor tweak to the ridiculous London video and then got
they
rid
did
of that
delete this one. And why did they delete? They have.
Well, maybe the palace got in touch.
Yeah, and
that's one possibility, right? Maybe Christopher Nolan got in touch and said, unless you want me to flame you online, I take that down.
Yeah.
Maybe one of the, commercial companies being depicted got in touch.
Exactly. And they haven't said why they deleted it. I think Oliver Dowden says something like, I don't know why that was deleted, or I haven't heard about that or something. And it's sort of, it's that, again, that feeling of like no one quite knows what's going on with this strategy, that someone in their social media team is putting out this kind of slightly mad stuff, and then they're not really sure how to defend it, so they don't.
But it feels kind of equally like it could be that the king has issued absolute bollocking, but it could equally be that someone on social media just panicked and deleted when they felt that they couldn't go back on that.
Well, can I direct your and listeners' attention to a poll of Tory councillors in the Telegraph on Saturday, which found, this is Tory councillors, right? Which found that 3/4 are dissatisfied with the government, and half of them, 47% to be precise, think that the Sunak government is too left-wing.
Blimey.
Just let that sit with you.
This is something I hear from people who like, who are Tory voting all the time. I hear them saying, it's very left-wing now. And I genuinely sort of don't know what to say to those people, but it's a really strong, I think because of things like furlough and stuff, they think that, just giving money to people as though that's the only thing that...
Or because he won't just, come out of the ECHR.
Yeah, or won't just, block the border.
And I love the comment by the chief executive of the Conservative Democratic Organization, which is a sort of grassroots organization, that sounds as if she's about to soften those figures. And she says, in my experience, most Conservative councillors will never talk down our party. So even though these figures paint a bleak picture, I'm sure they're actually even bleaker in reality. Ouch, Claire.
Good.
Hannah, is any of the Tory propaganda cutting through? Can you take us through the most recent polling? It seems to me quite unmoved.
So, in short, no. So the latest Politico poll of polls, which pulls together everything that we had at the end of March.
I love that tracker.
It's such a great tracker. And you can, if you want to look over a year, you can look over 6 months. It's quite a fabulous thing. Go and have a look. But so for the end of March, this is all the polls gathered at the end of March. It's only 8 days ago. Labour on 44%, Tories on 23%, Reform 13%, Lib Dems 10%, and Green 5%. Now, Green, I'm just going to point out, it's quite interesting. Greens are down from 7% in November. So there's no bounce away from Labour towards Greens as people like Owen Jones have been trying to, manufacture from the left. But yeah, the Tories have just been absolutely static for a really long time now. And there's been no movement in the last month with all this effort they're putting into the PR.
Yeah. I mean, there is, of course, a doppelganger theory that says maybe they would be even lower if they weren't doing all this stuff. We don't know what the road not
possible,
travelled
but I
looks
mean, even
like.
when they were doing some really stupid, even in the depths of the Rwanda debate, and also Sunak turning up and making random statements on Downing Street steps about social cohesion. Yeah. At that point, it didn't drop then either. It seems to really be the base seems to be about just above 20 now. Yeah,
basically, people have made their mind up. It feels like. Meanwhile, we have to talk about it briefly. Another week, another scandal. The pull factors are failing, and the push factors continue. Does the sexting story have any cut through? People love a bit of filth.
It doesn't seem to have much. I think there's two elements to this story.
Right.
There's the rag stuff and then the bigger picture. So obviously he's not the only one to have been targeted. Other MPs have been to the police and explained that they have had attempted blackmail or exploitation approaches with various kind of, sex pictures and so on. But the others all went straight to the police. Weirdly, it has not had any cut through. There's been obviously some fun made on social media, and there's equally been people supporting him on social media saying it's horrible to be a victim of any kind of exploitation. The thing I find really weird about it, and about anything like this, about these kind of like modern sex scandals,
do tell me,
is the things that they do to cover it up, like in this case, gifting sensitive phone numbers, are so much worse than the thing that they're embarrassed to share. And also, there seems to be no understanding that there is still public interest reporting rules in place. Nobody is good. Let's assume it's a dick pic that he sent. We don't know. To be clear, I'm just speculating.
It can be much
Some
worse,
kind
let
of
me tell you.
Image that he may have sent, or text that he sent, whatever it is that he didn't want to share in public. No newspaper is going to publish that. If he went to the police and said, this has happened to me and I've been fooled and I've shared something personal, but they're trying to extort me as a result, no newspaper would publish the crude details of that. There are public interest rules in place, and I know people love to trash the British press, but actually there does still need to be some public interest. And I think
I know
that
you
that
say
level of,
that,
like,
you
fear
say that, but can I
people.
just say that there is still a little underlying current of homophobia that runs through this country.
Of course,
okay?
I'm not denying that at all.
There's also the strategy to crank up attacks on Angela Rayner. Is there merit to this story, or is it, as David Lammy suggested on Sunday, just different standards applying to a working class woman?
I've genuinely tried to get into this story and work out what I think about it, because it's one of these things where I think I've seen it in the news a bit and just sort of ignored it because it didn't seem very interesting. And I thought, no, so I've read around it a lot and I've read Dan Needle's very good and very clear sort of analysis of what he think happened. I've read the Mail and all that sort of stuff. And I still don't feel like it's a big story. I don't think it's cutting through, because I don't think it is a huge story. I think there is a possibility that when she sold her flat, she was living with her husband at the time in a different place, and there might be some suggestion that perhaps she should have paid capital gains tax on that sale. I think that's arguable. I think you can have two homes. You can feel like you have two homes.
Yeah.
And there's lots of legal niceties to it, which are quite complicated, I think.
And also they split up quite soon
thereafter.
It might have been quite a complicated.
Yeah, and also I think, I didn't know this, that when you get married, if you have two flats, when you get married, you automatically have to sort of choose one of them to be your residence.
Yeah,
even
I
if
didn't know that either.
I think a lot of people wouldn't know that. And she wasn't an MP at the time. I think if it had happened when she was an MP, slightly different perhaps. And I think there is a question about the legal advice she's had and the tax advice. It's possible, having read Dan Needle's analysis, he says something about, the HMRC don't tend to go back more than 4 or 5 years unless it's really egregious. And so it's quite possible that someone said to her, look, just don't worry about it. Like, it might have been a mistake.
Yeah.
In the end, it was a couple of grand, it's fine. And in which case she might have been better advised to sort of say that out, up front and say, yeah, I made a bit of a mistake. Here's a couple of grand back to the HMRC. We're all sorted. Rather than kind of relying on this quite strict defensive, I've had the advice, it was fine, but we don't know. She hasn't released the advice. I can see why there's a little loose end there, that she hasn't sort of published the advice she's had, but you can also see why she doesn't want to start doing that, because then where does that end?
Yeah.
I mean, also, like, the question for the last 2 days that I've watched interviews with the Labour person doing the media rounds is, this story refuses to go away. That doesn't make it a story. The fact that the Daily Mail chooses to make
Keep
it front
going.
page news every day, the fact that Dan Hodges is obsessed with it, does not in itself make it a story worthwhile pursuing.
Yeah, and I think
this won't go away. This doesn't seem to be going away for Labour. I mean, it could be anything.
I think that for me,
it's beer and curry.
Exactly, and
it feels like that.
Absolutely, and it feels to me that this is simply trying to muddy the waters, and people who have the Tories' best interests at heart, trying to have this idea that Labour are just the same as the Tories, and I think that's dangerous. Really, I think it's dangerous for public, interest in politics and trust in politics, and it's clearly on such a different scale to some of the stuff we've seen from the Tories.
I mean, in a way, it's been quite useful for Labour that the figures around fraud, COVID relief fraud, came out in the same week. Because at least when you look at the two figures together,
just the whole thing of creating some sort of moral equivalence of maybe paying a few £100 less tax 10 years ago in a grey area.
Yeah, in a way that it's quite possible you can see how that mistake was made. Yeah.
With Tory donor making millions out of unusable PPE. I mean, it's ridiculous anyway. Next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week, who is this week's Adobe Photoshop 2024 and who is Windows 95 MS Paint. Paintbrush, as it used to be called, I think. Hannah.
Okay, my hero is London's RNLI. Did you know London had an RNLI branch?
I didn't know it had one of its own.
I was in Dorset, as I say, it was raining all week, so I ended up looking around lifeboats as you do with young children. I read today, this is fascinating, new stats out about the RNLI from the last year. Lifeboat crews saved 355 lives last year, and the majority of call-outs were along the Thames, and they have 4 stations along Greater London on the Thames.
Drunk people falling in, basically.
Possibly that.
Right?
All kinds of, there'll be like attempted suicides and stuff. There'll be all kinds of reasons.
But mainly drunk people falling in. Let's be honest,
but there we are. So that I didn't know that. That's a new thing, and I'm very delighted to hear that they're doing so well along the Thames.
Okay, and your villain of the week?
Villain of the week is the DWP. They are forcing tens of thousands of people on very low incomes who are carers to repay huge sums of money, sometimes up to £20,000, in erroneous overpayments or risk going to prison. And this is not their fault that they've ended up being overpaid their carers allowance by such significant sums. So people who care for a loved one for 35 hours or more a week are entitled to £81.90 a week in carers allowance. Yeah. And you can still take that if you're working part-time. You're allowed to earn up to £151 a week in another job and still claim that. But as soon as you go over that threshold, if you earn £152 or £153, you're not entitled to anything. It's a harsh cut-off. Wow. The DWP's IT system is supposed to kick in and know when you're earning more and stop paying you or reduce your payments if it's part of a universal credit and so on. But they've failed to act on this information and just kept paying out the money. So it's a systems failure, essentially. And now some people are earning tens of thousands that they've been paid over decades, and that they now are being told they have to pay back or will face prison time, which is so utterly grotesque. We are talking about people here who are earning so little anyway, and they're doing a job that the state has completely fallen back from in supporting people with, disabilities and other
strong entries, Matt.
Okay, so I've gone a slightly different route. My hero this week is a teacher in Texas called Dustin Eby, or he used to be called Dustin Eby, because he's changed his name by deed poll or whatever you call it in America to literally anybody else, in a plan to register as an independent candidate in the US presidential elections. He's a US Army veteran, and he's got a website, he's got a campaign, and he's basically, he's trying to register so that the ballot, at least in his area, will be Trump, Biden, or literally anybody else, which just really appeals to me.
Right. And villain?
Villain, a broad range. Racists on the internet. That's my villains. Specifically, all the people who attacked the casting of the new Romeo and Juliet production that came out last week, and there was a lot of announcements. They've announced Tom Holland, Spider-Man, is Romeo, and Juliet has been announced as Francesca Amawuda Rivers, and just got a deluge of awful people attacking for all sorts of horrible reasons. And they've come out, the company came out and put a very strong statement out saying this is horrific, this must stop. But yeah, it was just, I found it very depressing. I remember I saw the announcement and thought, oh, that's interesting. And then just like within seconds, you could see lots of horrible comments on it.
It feels like it should be a clean sweep to Hannah, but I do kind of love the teacher that has registered.
I'll take the teacher.
And the RNLI is a candidate for Hero of the Week every week, really. So I will give it to the teacher. What's his name?
Well, literally anybody else.
Literally anybody else. It is now. Yeah. And DWP will take Villain of the Week, because that is a nightmare scenario, as far as I'm afraid. That the state pays you over years more than they should through no fault of your own. And then suddenly they turn around and they say, give us back 20 grand or you're going to jail. Horrific. Now, more than 4 years since Boris Johnson declared Brexit done, businesses and consumers are still having to cope with bits of it still about to happen. Import charges on food coming in from the EU are about to be introduced, and they will, as so much of Brexit fallout has tended to do, disproportionately penalise small businesses. With the nation now pretty much unanimous that Brexit has been a horrible act of national self-harm, why do we continue to give ourselves daily paper cuts on top of the wound? Hannah, can you explain to us why Brexit is back in the news?
Why are we talking about it again?
What's this bit of it that's not done?
Okay, so the final details of the food and plant import charges from the EU for us have been confirmed, and that's just with a month to go before they came into force. They're coming into force on the 30th of April.
Ridiculous in itself.
Ridiculous in itself, and they've been delayed 5 times before because they've been trying to kind of find a way to make this palatable when basically it isn't. It means that there will be fees of up to £145 for food imports. And it's been described by people in the food sector as a hammer blow to British business, warnings that it will lead to higher food prices, which obviously nobody can tolerate right now. Yeah. And also the kind of less crucial thing, but still important about us as a country, less consumer choice, because EU suppliers are going to withdraw from our market because they don't want to pay this extra cost. And businesses will have a choice, really. They're going to have to push it onto the supplier, which they probably will, or push it onto the consumer, which nobody can tolerate right now. And it's just a load of old rubbish, basically. And it's also been broken the news over Easter while everyone was away on holiday or stuffing their face with Easter eggs and not really noticing what was going on. So it's the sly thing of slipping it out as well, with so little notice.
What issues specifically are the bodies and trade associations representing the sector warning about? What do they think? Why do they think, first of all, it will disproportionately affect smaller businesses? Do we know that?
Simply because of, if it's a flat charge, so up to 145, and if
it's a maximum for
that's for a complex mixed
right.
Import.
So if you're a big supermarket, a full pallet of chorizo will cost you less than a small deli who will
trying to import 5 or 6
small mixed pallet of some sausages
exactly.
and some cheese.
And also for a small business, that 145 represents a much bigger body of profit margin than if you're a major multinational player. So, William Bain, who's the head of trade policy at the British Chambers of Commerce, called it extremely disappointing and basically said, look, the government, you have completely failed to listen to our concerns. You haven't discussed. We've just been discussing this with you. We've delayed it 5 times, and here we are, and nothing that we've said has made any difference at all. I mean, the reason for that, obviously, is that Brexit is a complete con. Like, you get to the point where you think, there probably isn't much they can do because they've chosen to do this.
But still, within that horrible envelope, there is a way of doing things better,
and not telling people,
warning way ahead of the time, of consulting with the sector,
30 days
before. They did everything wrong about this, really. And I was doing some work on a different topic last week, and I was stunned by the data on SMEs. They account for 61% of employment in the UK, and 51% of all economic activity. So, a car maker building a heavily tax-subsidized new plant or a free port gets loads of headlines, but actually doing stuff that makes life marginally more difficult for millions of SMEs up and down the UK has more of an effect on the economy
and also
than bribing, a car maker to build their next model here, actually.
And also it has that very tangible effect on local economies. So, I mean, local food markets and local food stores, these are the things that people really feel when they go out and about, and they'll notice. So it's just bad politics, isn't it?
Matt, Brexiters are not happy with this either, right?
They're usually such fun lovers. I
know Jacob Rees-Mogg, usually very amiable, has described this as an act of self-sabotage, essentially trying to make the United Kingdom a mini European Union. What is his objection?
Well, he wrote a fascinating piece for GB News in which I think his essential objection seems to be that the UK left the EU to get rid of all these annoying checks and rules that the EU have, which are awful. But because the EU is obsessed with rules and checks, that's great because that means everything that comes from them can be assumed to be safe. So it's a sort of sleight of hand of checks are awful, but it's good that they have them, so we don't have to have them. it sort
So
of portrays...
does that mean the same logic surely means that stuff produced now within the UK is less safe?
Yeah, I think that's what he's...
Because it doesn't have to go through that rigorous...
It sort of portrays the UK as a slightly almost like parasitic thing next to the EU going, we'll use all of your rules and that's fine for you. And then we get the advantage of that, but we're not going to do any of that. So, I mean, it does suggest that, yeah, anything made in the UK, he's sort of implying doesn't need to worry about rules and therefore they should be worried about it. It just makes no sense. And then he brings up the concept of this new thing called the single trade window, which is not something I'd heard about, but it's basically, I think, a new government project to centralize all sort of customs and import systems into one computer system. And I looked it up and it's still in its early stages. It's sort of going through beta testing and stuff. And look, the government's been so successful with centralized computer systems in the past. It's going to be so exciting when this happens in 2064 or something, you know?
Yeah, it's going to be another massive success, I think.
Just in time for when we rejoin the EU.
Yeah.
Brexit was sold as a defence of British farming and fishing, and Jacob Rees-Mogg recently had a farmer on his show. Was his review of Brexit glowing? How did it go?
It wasn't glowing. This farmer, David Catt, did not enjoy Brexit and made that very clear. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think, it felt to me like he'd been briefed on the wrong guest, or that they'd got the wrong David Catt or something. You know, like that famous example where
they thought
BBC
they found the one person that liked Brexit, but no.
And that he's like, but farmers love this, and he was going, no, we don't. Farmers hate it. You know, and for example, the CAP, David Catt made the point that although the Common Agricultural Policy wasn't perfect, it did at least have certain standards, and it did think about how food security was important, that kind of stuff. And Jacob Rees-Mogg said the brilliant, again, I've mentioned Alan Partridge before, it was very Partridgey, just saying, well, every farmer I ever speak to hated the CAP. And he said, but I'm a farmer that you are speaking to, and I liked it, you know. So, yeah. He just couldn't, it was funny, he just couldn't pivot and just started interrupting him more and more and more. But the thing you mentioned about SMEs, there's a moment in that where the farmer talks about in Kent, fruit farmers are just packing up and not really doing that anymore. They're starting to just abandon apples and things like that because they can't make that profitable, and they're planting vineyards instead. And immediately Rees-Mogg is like, well, that's good, isn't it? Because, you know, British wine and blah, 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 we can presumably sell that in pints, you know, all that kind of stuff. And it's the same thing of like, well, maybe some fruit would be nice as well. You know, it's one of your 5 a day. Exactly. And it's the same thing of like, if you make things slightly harder, some people will just give up. Other people will try something new, but there's no guarantee that will work.
Yeah.
We don't know if there's a market for English wine on that scale. And so, Brexiteers always seem to be, to me, sort of suggesting there's a brilliant future just out of reach, that if we just all kind of got to it and knuckled down and all changed our jobs and started to do something totally different, then it'd be great. And without realizing there's a massive opportunity cost from the stuff we were just doing pretty well at in the first place.
Yeah. He ended up cutting him off, didn't he? He ended up stopping the interview. But Mr. Catt had the last word because he made a comment to the papers that goes as follows: I'm not going to be told by some pompous prick how things are. I'm not going to let him lie to me. Hannah, polling shows that almost 6 out of 10 voters now think Brexit has been a failure, and only just over 1 in 10 that it's been a success. Is this feeding the Tories' unpopularity actually in a really under the surface way?
Just constantly bubbling along.
Yeah.
I think every bit of news...
No one talks about it, but it seems to me that it's there in the background as either, depending on your point of view, on either you made this horrible thing happen or you fucked it up.
Yeah, you screwed up the delivery of it. I think with the news keep dripping out, so every time there's a new, like, you know, trade policy or a new disagreement with the EU over foreign policy or something, it adds to this sort of general sense of incompetence in the 2 ways, as you said, the failure to deliver on promises that were made, and then also failure to manage the country and the economy that we do have in a meaningful and sensible and profitable way. So this kind of idea that things are falling apart under the Tories bubbles along with Brexit being a major player in that, I think. And also, it is worth saying, I think, that Brexit was such a bad idea. I'm sure we all agree with this. Brexit was such a terrible idea that it could have probably been the same under any PM or administration. But because the Tories are so catastrophically shit at every other thing that's going on at the moment, public services are totally crumbling and so on, it does feel like it's uniquely a Conservative mistake.
Yeah. The Telegraph has apologised, sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
For Brexit.
It's like the biggest non-apology apology there.
Yeah,
isn't
it's
it?
like, it could have been brilliant, but...
We're sorry that you made a mess of it.
Does this general acceptance that it hasn't worked make it easier for an incoming government to negotiate a closer relationship? Will everyone just basically shut up about it?
Possibly at home, but I actually think that's less relevant than what the EU thinks, because it's really not about us anymore.
Yeah.
We made this decision. It's gone catastrophically wrong, but any kind of closer relationship or future bond or let's even cast our minds 30 years hence, maybe rejoining. I mean, the EU isn't going to want to be warm with us, I don't think. They want to, if they start cozying up to us really quickly under a new Labour government that's a bit more progressive on its ideas around Europe, that will not act as a deterrent to others thinking about potentially trying leaving. And they're going to want to show that we sort of deserve to be punished for jumping out away, I think. So I think, I do think it's a 2 or 3 decade project to warm relations back up again. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, whatever we want or hope.
Michael Gove, Matt, he's admitted to moral cowardice, he says, during the Brexit campaign, but only in a specific and limited way, as the saying goes. What did he say exactly?
Well, he did an interview with George Osborne and Ed Balls on their podcast Political Currency, which is not one that I've been listening to very much, but I have listened to it now. It feels like a betrayal, it has to be said. Well, basically they asked him, and it's quite an interesting conversation because it's about the Brexit, lead up to it. And Osborne says to him quite directly and says, well, did you feel like you betrayed David Cameron? Because Cameron was given the very strong impression that he wasn't going to take a prominent role in the Brexit campaign. And Gove says, yes, that's fair. I sort of did imply that, or did sort of say that. Right. And then he became chairman of the campaign, which is, I say, quite a prominent role. And then he says, I didn't want to do all of these interviews and speeches and debates and things, but I sort of got dragged into it by my peer group, essentially Dominic Cummings, I think, going, get out there. And he said, I mean, one thing he said, which I thought was quite noticeable, he said, people like Cummings were saying, you've got to get out there and do these shows, otherwise they'll book Nigel Farage, which I thought was kind of an interesting psychological thing of saying, well, at least I'm giving the vaguely sensible version of Brexit rather than the mad version. And it sort of does suggest maybe if things had gone slightly differently, then, Farage would have been even more prominent in that debate than we had. But he's very clear that he thinks that he was a bit cowardly, that he didn't say to Cameron more clearly, yes, I am going to be doing more of this stuff. It's kind of interesting. And his main takeaway from the referendum is basically never ever have a referendum. That's his main thing. It's bad for everybody. It destroys the people who called it, and it always messes up the country afterwards. So I think I agree with him on that.
Hannah, one last item of Brexit news to cover, and this is a weird one. We got some insight this week from a former UK diplomat into the thinking behind the UK quitting the Erasmus Plus programme. That's the programme where students go on exchange visits, basically. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, so I was interested to find that we quit rather than forced out. The way a lot of the reporting that was done on this a couple of years ago, having been a slightly lay reader of it, not taking a close interest on this particular issue, had sort of felt that it had just gone with the EU. But no, we chose to quit.
Yeah. And that came out a little bit later, that they made the offer and we weren't interested.
Insane, absolutely insane. But The reason that we quit was we decided it was too expensive. So the lack of uptake on the Erasmus scheme among British students, and generally we have been poor in terms of numbers going into that because for a lot of reasons, but primarily because not that many students are proficient in multiple languages or studying languages, and in other nations that's not the case. So we worked out that we'd be paying €300 million more a year than we received back in bald financial terms by these exchange programs. So
because
we'd be
fewer of our students went abroad.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So we were like putting into the pot and being part of this community, but really we weren't giving that many students that experience of our own, and so
And
we were
why was
taking them
that?
in. Well, and the reason that apparently the lack of uptake in Britain is because of, and I quote, a weak aptitude for language learning. Now, may I just say, it's not weak aptitude, it's a lack of appetite. And the appetite is set by policy and culture.
An opportunity.
And this country, an opportunity. I mean, we have created and embedded this idea that language is not important. You don't even have to study it to 16 anymore in this country.
Yeah.
So, of course, people aren't going on these cultural exchanges when they feel unconfident in foreign languages because they're told it doesn't matter at the age of 13. And to suggest that that's an aptitude issue rather than it makes me
So maybe putting some money
furious.
into languages would have been a
How
better
about
reaction
that?
than withdrawing.
How about that?
It's like deciding that I'm not going to buy a phrase book. I'm just always going to go on holiday to Bognor Regis from now on,
Essentially.
rather than having to deal with foreign things. That's pretty astonishing.
It's basically them saying, we told everyone not to learn languages and that Europe was rubbish. And then people stopped going to Europe.
And considering the conversation we were having about Britain's soft power, actually, what is interesting is that that didn't form any part of this.
No, and the idea that the people we were
exactly,
putting in is
because
a form
people
of soft power.
coming here is the important bit of the Erasmus program.
Yeah.
It's not how many students you send out there, but how
Classic.
many intelligent, well-educated future power brokers
Feel a relationship
with this country.
Idiots.
Idiots.
Isn't it? Why can't anybody else understand that? It's just, amazing.
We've reached the end of the show. So it's time for escape routes. What activities have we been using to distract ourselves from our justifiable outrage at Angela Rayner possibly getting away with a few £100 worth of tax 10 years ago? Matt.
Well, as stated earlier, I've been on holiday, so I've been reading lots of novels, which was a lot of fun. But I did want to recommend 2 non-fiction books that I read on holiday or have just been reading. One of which was something I just picked up in a charity shop out of nowhere. Just thought, this looks interesting. And it's really fun. It's called Dropping Names by Frank Langella, the American actor. And it's just a really interesting book. It's basically just does what it says on the tin. It's him doing anecdotes about famous people he's met. And it's like being, and each chapter's 2 or 3 pages, and it's like just being able to, every time you pick it up, just having a little chat with a sort of very gossipy person backstage in a theatre.
That sounds great.
And he's met and slept with quite a lot of famous people, it seems. People like Elizabeth Taylor, Rita Hayworth. There are stories about Jackie Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Gielgud, Olivier. There's all these huge names, and also less well-known names.
Yeah.
And it's really fun.
Did he sleep with all of the above mentioned?
Yeah, it's more than you would have thought. More than you'd have thought.
I like that.
And then the other one is a book that was just published quite recently called The Trading Game by Gary Stevenson, who people might know as Gary's Economics. He's got a YouTube channel and a TikTok and all that kind of stuff, which I watch, and I think it's very interesting. And he's written this memoir of his time working in the city, where he was a trader. At one point, he was the most profitable trader, I think, possibly in London, certainly in his bank. And it's this fascinating story because he comes from a very working class background in Ilford, and it's kind of this funny, terrifying. It's sort of a lesson about economics, but it's also kind of a horror story about how he lost himself in that world. Brilliantly written, really sort of propulsively written, and really gets to the heart of the problems in the financial industry post 2008, because he joined in 2008 and saw the whole crash happen, and his whole insight into why it happened and why it's still happening.
Sounds great. How about you, Hannah?
So I've started watching a show on Netflix called Fisk, which is basically about a female lawyer in her late 40s, post-divorce, moved to Melbourne, back to her family. It's light, it's a bit daft, but if you really liked Bridget Nyborg in Borgen, it's almost like the light-hearted version of that character, like a midlife woman going through personal crisis, but in her professional life, personal life, and it's a lot more fun. It's a comedy. So yeah, definitely recommend it. I'm enjoying that. But also, and a kind of not everyone can partake in this, but if you live in Dorset, I went to the Jurassic Coast with my kids and managed to find 5 ammonites on the beach just walking around. You can just find fossils, and I found that the most kind of mindful, shut off from the world of digital, politics and all of that, and just contemplate how everything's been there for millions of years, longer than you. And we'll go on
they make them in the cement yard round the corner, right, for tourists.
I honestly
strew
cracked
them
one
along
out by myself from the rock, and it was a pleasing thing.
That sounds great. I finally managed to get round to watching Anatomy of a Fall.
Right.
It really is some of the most extraordinary acting, I think, that I've seen in a long, long time. There really isn't a bum note in it. It was a joy from start to finish, and really makes you question what you think of other couples based on seeing a sliver of their lives and usually only hearing one side of the story. So I found it extraordinary and very challenging. And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? All that remains for me is to apologize to listeners for sounding a bit jazzier than usual. I'm getting over a bout of the flu, and to say thank you to my panel. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Thursday for our backers, whom we love and cherish greatly, and Friday morning for everyone else, who we also love, but backers on Patreon, and we might just love you a little bit more. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.